So we have short sentences and the long shadows of his story. This is how a war reporter, a war correspondent with a typewriter basically left his mark on how the literature in the last century sounded. You probably read him in high school, but I'm Matt Haskell. I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm taking you line by line through Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, and we're on to the start of the next verse, and we'll open it up with Hemingway. And when Billy Joel sings Hemingway, he's pointing to Ernest Hemingway. He was the novelist, reporter who had a very lean style and this kind of, big persona. And he kind of, he helped define 20th century American literature, American writing. And if you start with, first of all, just the creation of his voice. After World War One, serving in World War One as an ambulance driver and receiving a serious wound while in Italy, Hemingway ended up in Paris in the 1920s among the artists and the writers that were often called the Lost Generation. He learned from journalism and from mentors like Gertrude Stein that, if you could strip the prose down to nouns and verbs and just let the meaning sit beneath the surface, the iceberg theory, right? That only an eighth of the iceberg is actually visible while 7/8 is below the water. You end up with his approach to writing. You had early collections and novels like In Our Time and The Sun Also Rises, and it turned boxing gyms and trout streams and bull rings in Pamplona into these very sparse sentences that carried this surprising emotional charge. Then he has a big middle period. You have the Farewell to Arms in 1929, and that just kind of braided together, love and war into this brutal ending that felt, more true than romance. And then as a correspondent in the Spanish Civil War, he saw ideology collide with reality. So, For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940, it turned that experience into, a story of sabotage and loyalty and sacrifice, in the mountains. And between assignments, he would hunt and he would fish, and the public, eventually met the myth, safari photos, marlin fishing in bars, but the work stayed on the page, stayed meticulous. There were short declaratives, there were exact nouns, and one detail that did the work of five. It was very, very Spartan. The late triumph for him was The Old Man and the Sea in 1952, probably one that you read in high school. I know I did. And it was a slim novel about persistence and loss that eventually, earned the Pulitzer in 1953 and helped bring the Nobel Prize in 1954. That same year, near fatal plane crashes in Africa left him injured and kind of just followed him around as like a shadow for the rest of his life. He moved between Cuba and Idaho. He wrote, he revised, and he struggled with injuries and illness. And in 1961, he died by suicide. And it closed a life that mixed bravado with a type of vulnerability. So why does his name show up in the song? Why is it in the lyric? Well, it's because Hemingway stands for a style as much as a person. You cut out the adverbs, you find the verb, you put the truth under pressure, and just let the reader experience it. It also marks an era when writers were public figures. You had war correspondents and global travelers, and they were faces on magazine covers, and they were turning headlines into literature. Now, reading him now means, it means taking the power and the problems into consideration, right? The sentences, they're short and they still hit, and the Hemingway hero, you have, they're stoic and they're wounded and they're stubborn, and it does cast a long shadow. And critics also press on the blind spots, women who are written at the edges. You have myth making that really just kind of like levels out or flattens real places. And both things can be true. And, the conversation does keep the work alive. When you tie it all back to the song, his surname just evokes the Lost Generation, the iceberg theory, and this mid-century image of fame that fused together life and literature. And the reason why Hemingway matters It explains how form becomes influence. Journalism, a style of journalism that sharpened a style of fiction. You have restraint that made emotion louder, and a public writer that turned global events into these long-lasting, enduring stories. If you enjoyed this particular episode of We Didn't Start the Fire, please leave a like, a follow, a share, a comment. All those things would be awesome. We're moving on from Hemingway now to the second lyric, and that would be from Hemingway to Eichmann. Thanks for watching.